So good evening, everybody. I would like to begin by acknowledging that wherever we are in Australia, we live, work and we play on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land. My life is lived in Naarm on the lands of the peoples of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples that may be present with us tonight. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander sovereignty of this land was never ceded, and the impact of colonisation is ongoing today. I spend my work days looking out to the bay on the lands of the Bunurong, and I follow the bends of the Corrate Creek to my home on Wurundjeri country. As I walk this land today, I do so knowing that this country has been walked and cared for millennia before me, and I open myself to hear those stories, those full of joy, wisdom and wonder, but also those of sorrow, heartbreak and loss. I embrace the future and wisdom of my home and look toward a future that fully acknowledges, respects and values all of this country's history, experiences and knowledges. I would like to thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Mel Brown and I'm the Sustainability Librarian at Hobsons Bay Libraries. We are recording tonight's event, so just a reminder to you all, if you would prefer not to be included in the recording, you can turn your cameras off, otherwise you are welcome to leave them on tonight. We have muted attendees as they join us tonight, just so we don't have any background noise impacting on the event. However, if you do have a question or a comment, we do encourage an interactive event this evening, and we'll make sure to make time for questions from the audience at the end. Tonight's event is being brought to you by Hobsons Bay Libraries and the Hobsons Bay City Council as part of the Global Learning Festival. As a Sustainability Librarian, I look after the EnviroCentre collection located at the Altona Newport Library branches. The EnviroCentre, as well as providing selectively curated sustainability resources, including equipment, also runs a regular calendar of events, of which tonight is one. We love feedback from the community about what titles and speakers they would like us to include, so please don't hesitate to get in touch with any suggestions. Tonight's event is a part of the Global Learning Festival. The festival seeks to provide unity and connection to communities all over the world. By participating in learning events on a wide variety of topics across time zones and languages, we can experience firsthand the benefits that lifelong learning can bring to us all. Just going to come in and see if I can mute somebody there. Apologies. Excellent. So tonight's event should be something special. We are being joined by Marco de Brömmelstroet. Marco is the Chair of Urban Mobility Futures at the Amsterdam Institute for Social Science Research at the University of Amsterdam. His teaching centres on the relationship between land use developments and mobility behaviour. As founding academic director of the Urban Cycling Institute, he strengthens the links between academia and how cycling relates to the urban and social environment. Cycling often offers him a lens to radically reimagine the way in which society thinks about mobility, transport systems and the street. His Fitz Professor, the Cycling Professor Twitter account has over 90,000 followers. Marco, together with journalist Talia Vacard, released the book Movement, How to Take Back Our Streets and Transform Our Lives in May this year. We are very delighted that Marco has made time for us tonight to chat about the ideas that are discussed at length in his book. Now, our friends at Scribe Publications have organised a special code for viewers tonight to get a 20% discount on the book. So I'll put the link in the chat to the Scribe Publications website in a moment, and then in the checkout, if you use the code MOVEMENT, that discount will be applied. And I'd like to thank Cora Roberts at Scribe Publications for assisting with making tonight's event possible. Also a thank you to and an acknowledgement to Fiona Graham, who was the translator on this book as well and made it possible for all of us to read in English. So joining us for this conversation are some locals with a very keen interest in the subject of Marco's book. Bike West is an organisation that advocates for more state-of-the-art cycling infrastructure in Melbourne's West. They do this by submitting proposals for cycling infrastructure to councils and providing feedback on planned projects to ensure they're in accordance with the newest safety standards and meet the needs of the cycling community. From Bike West, we are being joined by John Simons, President, and Pierre Viro. John is currently a Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for Sustainable Industries and Livable Cities at Victoria University. He's worked extensively on the economic benefits of road safety interventions in developing countries, as well as active transport and green infrastructure. And Pierre is an amateur urban planner who wants to see positive change to his suburb. Please join me in welcoming and handing over for tonight's conversation to John and Pierre.
Hello there, and I just want to thank Marco so much for being part of this discussion tonight. It's an absolute pleasure and honour for you to have you talking to us. Many of us have been admiring your work for quite a long time, and we were very excited to get the opportunity to speak to you. So thanks again for that. Now we've read the book, and in the book, one of the key issues you raise is how streets are not thought of as only places for cars, but I think now people think of them as places only for cars, but it wasn't always the case. So people have forgotten that streets used to be for all road users, and that really struck home to us during COVID, when a lot of our kids and people in our street, we played out in the road, we're out in the road a lot. But some of our neighbours complained about that our kids were playing football in the street, and they actually complained to the council to try and remove the little temporary goals we got put up in the street in a very angry response. And we're just wondering, the issue of streets and being places for more than just car drivers promotes such emotional responses from us. So why do you think it's so hard for us to let go of this idea that it's not just for cars?
Well, first, before I'm responding, I actually want to return the thanks for having this conversation with me and giving me the opportunity to speak to the other side of the world in this way. So thanks for that. Thanks for the question, and an extra shout out to Pierre, who I see is multitasking here and bringing the next generation to the debate. So shout out for you, and thanks for the question. I think this question already goes to the core of what the book is about. So why is it that there are such aggressive responses to proposed changes? Why is it that if you want public spaces that are safe for children, you are considered a radical activist or an advocate? Why are the others not seen as radical? And I think this is also part of the answer to the question. Because we take it for granted. You refer to that people think about streets as places for cars, but I would argue that people do not think of streets at all. Streets are just a given. It's something we take for granted. It's in the background of many. And because of that, it became an important underlying condition of how our society functions. So I like this quote that actually comes from the gender debate. And the quote is, when you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression. So we take something for granted, which is actually a privilege, the fact that we can use public space to go fast with a personal vehicle from A to B. Our society became dependent on that, so we built it around that notion. But that notion can only work if we ignore the impacts it has. So it's very akin to the discussion on economic growth. So it can only keep functioning as it currently is functioning if we ignore all the impacts. So as soon as you start questioning that underlying, people feel that they will lose something valuable for them, the privilege to use that space. Because as soon as you say, hey, it's public space, we should have a much deeper discussion on this. Everybody, I think, feels that we can no longer then monopolize it for use of traffic, and therefore we really need to rethink important parts of our cities and our society. So it starts with a very boring thing like traffic engineering, but as soon, and that's what we try to do with the book, as soon as we see it as the deeper questions that underlie how we are using our public spaces, I think that's what explains the violent response, because people feel that they have something to lose.
I've been pondering this question for a long time, and because I'm an economist. I try to fit an economic lens to it, and I've I've tried to say, is it to do with this thing called prospect theory? I don't know if you're familiar with it, where these researchers say that people in general value loss twice as much as any potential gains. So therefore the emphasis is I'm more concerned about what I might lose in terms of my driving than what I might gain in terms of the public amenity or the better place that it might be.
Yeah, this is I think so when we have this as a starting point, right? So the fact that we see that public spaces are actually heavily contested, but we forgot about that. So we sort of take for granted that the last couple of decades the streets have become this technical engineering question. Then of course, because you can write a book about that and then say, okay, that's the book, but it's very cynical. So actually, what we try to do here is to offer ways where we think change can happen, and it's drawn on movements that occurred in the Netherlands and across the world. And one of the key things that will come back also in this conversation, I guess, a lot is we need to change the conversation, exactly because the conversation is now about loss, while it shouldn't be, right? So one example of that is that in general, if you ask people if they're willing to give up their parking space, you already know what the answer will be. If you ask shop owners to give up the parking space in front of their shop, you're asking them about, are you willing to lose something?
Yeah.
But if instead you use a discourse, a narrative, a story, a question that actually asks the question, what you can add to that public space. So for instance, do you want your streets to allow your children to play there, or to have autonomous to be able to use the neighborhood and even the city autonomously on a young age? Many more people are then rallying around that, because suddenly it becomes clear that actually they have been losing, right? I think the group that has been losing most in this, and we haven't discussed that, we haven't debated that, it just happened, but the group that lost the most are our children. Our children have lost the right to use public space, to develop themselves, to develop social relations, to develop interactions with their environments. And as soon, I think, if we shift the conversation there, many more people will rally around and will support the change that we are talking about here.
And that one of the losses that those young people have is that the massive impact it can have on either serious injuries or fatalities for young people. And obviously there's a big thing. So that's what we're talking about, road safety. I actually want to pass over to Pierre now, because I don't want to monopolize all the questions. So we've got a few things we want to ask you. I'll let Pierre jump in now about road safety.
Yeah, Marco, before I ask the pre-canned question, I just want to say thank you, and also to Hobson's Bay for organising this. It's a great event. Yeah, Marco, you touched on it. I've got the next generation here, and if I allow myself to be purely selfish for a moment, a lot of the change I would like to see in my community is so that this little guy can walk himself to primary school in 4 or 5 years' time, and he can ride himself safely to the local high school in 12, 13 years' time. But not just for my kid, for all of the neighbourhood kids that I see. I had the privilege of riding to school and not being stuck in traffic, and I would like to see as many other young people have that opportunity to sort of autonomously get around their cities safely, and also give parents a break from having to drive their kids around and be taxi drivers. So the pre-canned question that we had, your book starts with a story about congestion and about how cycling superhighways can reduce congestion. We have a similar thing in Australia. Politicians and local officials, they only ever talk about congestion when it comes to traffic. It's never about safety or general health, despite the impacts on both. Advocates in cycling infrastructure feel that they have to talk about congestion in order to be heard. Why is it that we are so desensitized to motorized traffic violence and will pay billions to sit in a traffic jam for a little bit less every day, and until, of course, the motorway or the freeway fills up again and congestion rises?
Yeah, awesome question. And the question I can dwell on, I think, because for me, so we wrote the book, or actually I would have to say Talia Fekade wrote the book as a journalist in a conversation with me. As an academic, I actually want to explore all these rabbit holes, and this is one of them. Because why is this the case? And I also I put all my thoughts in an additional book which can be freely downloaded. It's an English book. It's called Mobility Language Matters, and it's sort of the scaffolding of the book, right? It's the academic. It's much more boring, but it sort of tries to capture the underlying ideas. And I think there is a partly an answer to your question. Because this brings us to the language we speak and have learned to speak to think about mobility. But again, it starts with the notion that this is not a given. This has been carefully manufactured and constructed about 100 years ago. And there's a great book about that by Peter Norton, Fighting Traffic. And he shows that between 1920s and 1930s, when the car or the mass motorization happened, we had to find a new language. And that language we now take for granted as traffic engineering, but I think it's valuable to go into that and to see which choices were made. And one of the key things, and I will not go in all the details, maybe two. The first one is that the first traffic engineers were water engineers, so they were looking at the street as pipelines that should never be clogged, and that metaphor became very dominant until today. Like we still see the main way to look at streets is they should never be clogged. They should always cater for maximum capacity. And that simple choice that we once made and haven't discussed and take for granted still defines where we spent our money, where we spent our billions, because the system should never be clogged. A clogged pipeline is really a problem. So that's one. And the second one that is related to that is that when we started to simplify humans in that system, we also had to find a language for that. And that was the language taken from economic thinking, and seeing humans as homo economicus, with the notion, and every traffic engineer can dream about this, that traveling is a derived demand. People want to be at A or B as a homo economicus. They want to maximize their utility. And being underway is a disutility, is something negative. You want to reduce. And that brings us to the sort of taken for granted goal of the mobility system. The purpose, the function of the system is to lead to travel time savings. Travel time savings are the gold, right? In all the traffic models, this is where societal gains are, in individual travel time savings. So if you can solve congestion, your models will show that individuals will gain travel time, and there's a value attached to that. And all the other values, the negative values, the fact that this travel time gains, first of all, do not exist empirically, because people will not travel less time, they will travel further distances. That's what we already know for decades. So the models are wrong. But more importantly, even if they're right, these individual mobility gains are subsidized by externalizing all the costs. Because even if you can solve the travel time gains, this comes at a huge expense on society and the environment. And this is not included, or not well included in the model. So it's a manufactured language that is used by the industry to manufacture a desire. Just be aware that at least in the Netherlands, I don't know in Australia, but probably it's the same there. In the Netherlands, every half an hour on all radio stations, everybody hears that there's congestion somewhere. Every half an hour. That's 350 minutes a week on every radio station. There's not a single other problem in the world that gets a similar amount of attention. So it's a manufactured problem, because if you hear this all your life, every half an hour on the radio, you start thinking this is a huge problem. But in fact, there are just some people waiting. And instead, so one of the things that we are doing is questioning that discourse. So I'm also an idea for Australia. We are going to pilot this in Slovenia, of all places, where Radio 1 of Slovenia is going for 1 week, not going to air the traffic updates. And the 350 minutes that they save, they will use to instead talk about the fatalities and honor the people that have died that week in traffic. And I'm completely convinced that if you would do that for half a year, this would completely shift the sense of urgency of people, because that's the real problem. And as soon as we start talking about it, and that relates to a final thing here, and maybe we also cover that in other questions, but it's also there's also a part of the problem, I think, is in this traffic safety discourse. So we have been talking about traffic safety as something that we, because yes, we want children to go safely to school. But in the current discourse, and again, I think it's carefully manufactured. In the Netherlands, we teach our children at the age of 4, they get road safety at school, at some of the schools, which is always financed by car industry. And what they learn is that it's dangerous and that they should be disciplined, that they should have high vis, that they should look both ways. They cannot be distracted. You cannot play with the ball. You cannot play with other kids. You have to be disciplined because it's dangerous. And because of that, we are implicitly normalizing the violence. So we are not talking about the violence, the fact that cars became bigger, more cars, they are faster, they accelerate faster, distraction in cars increased, all at the same time that we say that we take safety as an important element, we increased violence. We sort of, so I think we should stop talking about road safety. And I argue we should start we should dismantling all these organizations, or at least rename them into road violence organizations. And they should focus on the violence and not on the safety, because the violence is completely man-made. It's not natural. It's man-made violence. And if we keep talking about the safety around that, we are ignoring the elephant in the room.
Yeah, fascinating.
And maybe one final thing, because you actually what you want is you also want to rally the other parents of the schools in your neighborhood. And again, that leads back to the first question, the first conversation. I think the only way to do that is also to talk in a different narrative. So why is this so important? And I think you already touched upon that. And I think you should then maybe tell the stories of why was it so important for you as a kid to be free and autonomous in your neighborhood? Because we forgot about the importance of that, the importance that children should roam and should develop themselves. So I think that's instead of trying to rally parents around traffic safety, that's only leading to a limited support. But if you start talking about the importance of their children being happy and balanced adults, then it becomes an important part of good parenting. And I think that resonates with many more people than our current narratives.
Can I jump in, Pierre? You've just killed my next question, Marco. Thanks very much. But it does refer to it actually makes me think of I listened to a podcast this morning by the Happiness Lab. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's an academic out of Yale University. And the particular issue this morning was regarding happy parents leads to happy kids. And we as a society have increasingly sheltered and just smothered our children, where we won't let them walk to school, we won't let them ride, we won't let them explore. And the impacts of that are that while in the short term, great, my kid is safe home at the end of the day, but the long-term implications of that over a very long period of time, as you get profoundly unhappy kids who don't have that independence, don't have that autonomy. So you've kind of asked it, but I mean, I was always pondering why there isn't more, why young people and parents aren't jumping up and down more about these issues. Why we have to flip the conversation, instead of it being a road safety one, I suppose, to being no, they have to be more happier and more independent.
Yeah. Well, that brings me also to the point to say that our book is not a mobility or street book. The street is a case, a public space, but it is you could write the same book, or the book could inspire the same debates about all these things. And this is clearly one that's also related. Is the way that we talk about things matter, right? We simplify the world, and we have to. It's impossible not to. But the way that we do that matters, and we need to. If we want radical change, if we see difficult problems or dilemmas, we should develop sort of a leniency or a reflection to think about, but how is the language that we use around this helping or not helping? And in the case of children, it's of course related also to much bigger developments of a risk society and the increased notion that children are, it's quite recent. We also find in research, but it's this idea of cultivated or concerted parenthood, that children almost do not have unadulterated time anymore. So
No,
even if they are not with their parents, they are at activities that are organized for them.
The
And
expression
partly-
I heard, sorry, Mark,
Yeah.
the expression I heard this morning was lawnmower parenting, where you actually just smooth out the path in front of them for everything, so they're
Yeah,
never
it's,
challenged, so they never experience anything,
Yeah,
and they're always being, managed.
We call that curling parents, like the
Oh,
curling,
curling, of course.
with the stick. But yeah, exactly. And it's partly, so another thing that's related is this idea that a good parenting is investing in your child. So your child becomes sort of an investment, and you basically indeed give up your own happiness because you're investing all your time in shuttling your kid to places where there's investment in the kid. So what do we see from this is indeed, as you say, in the long run, but already in the short run, we see a huge epidemic of anxiety in children and stress, and in parents as well.
Yeah.
And so I was once in Australia, and I talked in Sydney to a group of people, and I talked about the movements in the Netherlands that people rallied on the street for change. And then somebody in the audience, Stephen Fleming, you might know him, he stood up and he said, that's all fun and games, but who is now willing to go out and risk a time in prison for a bicycle path? And that led... Well, yeah, but I think many people won't, and rightfully so. But that also leads to the lesson. They also didn't. That was not why people rallied on the street in the 1970s in Amsterdam either. It wasn't about bicycles. It was about much deeper values, and that's, I think, so. Again, so we talked about it there, and then one of the things we talked about is that people might be willing to rally on the street for change if you connect our streets to this epidemic of loneliness or anxiety, and more people are dependent on medication to solve all kinds of mental issues, and those mental issues are caused by many things, but are much related to how we use our public spaces and streets and our mobility system, and those links are currently not made. And I think if you're able with storytelling and narrative to make that link, again, I think so that's also part of the conversation. If you want to rally for bicycles, the first thing you have to do is to stop talking about bicycles. Get out of the traffic engineering debate and link it to debates to which people care. And that's the happiness of their children. That's for everybody very important.
I actually, as Mel mentioned at the beginning, we put in a lot of submissions to council to try and get them to do better cycling infrastructure. And having read your book recently and speaking to some other people, I actually included in that submission regarding the issue of loneliness and how, while a car may not kill you, there's different ways cars can kill you. They can kill you by hitting you, but if they make us build cities which increase loneliness, and that will eventually kill you. If you don't be hit by the car, then the loneliness will get you. And I brought up the example of the story of Roseto. I don't know if you're familiar with the story of Roseto, where it's a town in the US where essentially an Italian village post World War II, the whole village moved over to the US, and the sense of community connection, the very strong, that everyone was talking to each other on the street, and the levels of heart attacks and blood pressure and all those things were massively lower than neighboring towns because they had that really strong social connection, and they didn't have that social isolation. But over time, as the town became more like the other towns, that difference disappeared, and their levels of heart disease and so on became the same as all the other towns. And the same thing is seen in those blue zones all around the world, where one of the key factors is social connection. And if you build cities, and Don Appleyard talked about this in the 80s, about if you've got a busy street, you're going to have fewer friends on that street than if you have a street with less car traffic traveling down that street.
Exactly, and this is why I think the challenge that we have in the subtitle is how to take back our streets is we should stop. So we are also lured into talking about streets with traffic engineers, and traffic engineers can bring a lot, but they also limit the discussion, and because of that, we are not talking about these things. And I think the only way that we can really radically reclaim our public spaces is by doing that. Because if you do that, you will. I strongly believe, and I have increasing evidence that this happens also with our book in the Netherlands. you will start talking to completely new groups of people that were not even aware. So one example here is a foundation in the Netherlands called Jantje Beton. Jantje Beton is a foundation that actually fights for more play for children.
Yeah.
They were not aware before we basically told. They were not aware that they also have a stake in mobility policy, and now they're like, oh, so why are children playing less and less outside? Oh, this might have to do with the fact that our streets are completely given away to traffic. Oh, that's, yeah, of course. How could we not see that? So that conversation, I think, and that's really also why I'm quite skeptical about what happened with the bicycle in the Netherlands, because the bicycle and the movement in the 1970s to use the bicycle as symbol for change was co-opted by traffic engineering, and we achieved a lot. The Netherlands is a great example of what you can achieve for safe cycling, but within the traffic engineering narrative. It didn't help us to solve loneliness. It didn't connect it that much anymore to bigger societal issues. So that's, I think, a big warning for elsewhere. And one place where it's following a different route, which I think is very inspirational, is Paris. And Paris is also doing a lot for cycling, but it's not called a cycling program. It's called the 15-minute city. And the 15-minute city is about principles of solidarity, participation, ecology, which then leads to all kinds of changes that then traffic engineers can help us with. But I think we really need to learn and relearn to talk about those things. So it's great to hear that you are including loneliness, because I think again that many more people will be interested in that, in fighting for that.
I'm curious to know I don't know what the response was from council. I suspect they would have just laughed at me when I included it, but I'm increasingly of the belief that it's incredibly important, and getting them to change the way they think. And this is what I next question hand over to Pierre, but unfortunately you have kind of answered it already. But I'll let Pierre jump in for the next bit.
I'll jump in. You mentioned Paris and its 15-minute city. We're a little bit less ambitious in Australia. I think we're 25% less ambitious, and we're aiming for a 20-minute city. And our government strategy documents reflect that. They call for a 20-minute city, and they call for all of a lot of the things, a lot of the benefits that you and John were just talking about. The strategy documents, for the most part, are good. But when it comes to the implementation of that strategy document, our governments give up at the slightest hint of community opposition. They give up, and we've had, the typical one: you can't remove my parking, and then silly ones like cycle lanes will impact the heritage value of our street. You said that we should rephrase our language when dealing with governments, but it almost seems to me and John, at the sort of front line of this issue, that it's the community itself, it's our, it's the residents and our neighbours. Can you give us any tips on how we punch through that community resistance, or better educate the community on the benefits of not just cycling, but all of the, the wider benefits that those sort of reclaimed streets can give a city?
Yeah, but again, I think indeed, so we are honing in on the importance of language. So it's a book about linguistics almost. But reviewers told us you shouldn't say this because it sounds boring. But it's in the end, I think that's where it's so empowering. If you see, and there's already in the chat somebody referred to a MOOC that we developed around that. As soon as you develop the skill to what Donella Meadows called dancing with paradigms, if you're able to do that, and indeed, I think it was also my response to John, it's not the council. It's in the end using language to give citizens more feeling of urgency, and then the council will respond. Change will not come from the council. It never did. The radical change comes first from societal movements that are pressing issues that we were not aware of. Like it was not the experts or the traffic engineers that changed Amsterdam into the city that it is today. Actually, they were doing the opposite. And it was the people that said, stop it. And they had to find a new language. that united them. So you might have heard of Stop the Kindermoord, stop killing our children. There was only one of it. It was also about the right for affordable housing, for instance. And it was about connecting all these things together. And that's I think the role that we can play, is to offer narratives and stories that link these things together. That will be powerful. And again, so referring to the 15 or 20 or 25 or 10, 5, 1 minute cities, it's not about the minutes. So I just checked. There's Carlos Moreno did a TED talk on this. He was the one of the founding persons behind the idea in Paris. And he I think it's a 10-minute TED talk, and it's worth to watch it, because it's not about the 15 minutes as a traffic engineering concept or as an accessibility measure. It's about ecology, proximity, solidarity, and participation. So that's the 15-minute city. And it's about creating neighborhoods and cities where people can have a valuable life without being dependent on fast mobility. That's something that people understand. Like, oh, yes, that's what I want. Oh, if you want that, there's all these things that have to then happen. So we then, of course, so in Paris currently, 10,000 car parking spots are removed. But you have much more support for that, because people understand it. It's not we are taking something away from you, so we have to work on this. 168 elementary schools in Paris are currently made car-free, completely. This will never happen in the Netherlands, because we don't have a narrative that's convincing. So in the Netherlands, school zones are still really problematic in terms of solving it with a traffic engineering mindset. So I think that's where you want to go. You want to develop those stories, and then I think that's also connected to that. There's an example that I can point you to, as we have tried to do that in the city of Groningen, famous also for cycling, but also they find out now that cycling brought them being more stuck in the traffic engineering mindset. And what they did now is they developed a new guideline, and the guideline says streets are public spaces where at least 10 different societal issues have to be resolved. And one of the issues is traffic, but that's only one. It's 10%. We also have meaning, or social cohesion, or climate, or water retention, you name it. And that, first of all, shows that it's complex. So you cannot give it to an expert. So you have to have debates. We have to make tough choices. So it becomes much more about participation. But also it invites many more experts to the table. Because what happens, at least in the Netherlands, if you want change, you talk about all kinds of stakeholders, but the expert from the municipality that's on the table is always the traffic engineer. Because the traffic engineer is used to have a monopoly on how to design the street. And we have to get around that. So you have to, if we can develop guidelines and if we can educate the general public that streets are actually places where other experts should also have a say. And by definition, this means that that's also what people then say, but then it becomes much more difficult to make decisions. Yes, it needs to be much more difficult to make decisions. It's because by making it easy, by simplifying it, we have created the problem that we are now in. So we need to make it more complex, and stories help. And that's why I think the 15-minute city, but only in that light. So we also wrote a piece in The Guardian linking it to the similar debate in agriculture and the problem of monoculture. You don't want monoculture. You also don't want to replace it with a new monoculture. You don't want cities. You don't want a Dutch city where everybody bikes. That's still a monoculture. You want streets that we treat as gardens. And a bad garden is a garden of monoculture. You want to, and it's only 100 years ago that we forgot about this. But 100 years ago, streets were places of very diverse culture. Many things happened on our streets, especially in cities, and we need to get back to that. And I think that's also relating back to the first question, because it's comfortable to not think about that, as long as it works.
And a lot of people prefer not to. They just want to be able to jump in the car. And I think we have to rename our organisation from BikeWest to Ecology, Proximity. What was the other one? Something West.
Ecology, Proximity, Solidarity, and Participation.
Yes.
But again, so that's also what I explain to students, is that's just another set. And the whole point of Dancing with Paradigms is you can think about dozens of other combinations.
Yeah.
And it's you have to find the one that works. And I think that's why I think, for instance, in the Netherlands, what currently works well is to focus on autonomy of children, but because that's something of a heritage. The children in the Netherlands are relatively free still.
Yes.
But it's quickly deteriorating, and people see it. So that story helps. Maybe in Australia, the loneliness question helps, but you have to find things that, and by doing that, teach but also cultivate in yourself the notion that streets are much more complex than just the traffic engineering suggests.
Absolutely. There's a consultant here whose name is Stephen Burgess, who his particular framing of these things, he calls streets as places for either movement or exchange. So from one and a continuum. So one extreme being the movement, which we would call a highway or a freeway. They're not free, but you know what I mean, where you're traveling at 100 kilometers an hour, and the opposite being a local sort of shopping street or whatever, or the residential street, where the exchange can be any type of exchange. It can be just an exchange of a hello. It can be the social exchange. It could be an economic exchange in terms of buying things. So I'm just wondering, because I don't think Australia is quite ready to jump into that whole paradigm shift into the way thinking about streets. We have to think of a way that we can actually get the attention of local council or states. And we're wondering if that movement and exchange notion would be one worth exploring for us.
Yeah, for me, it resonates with the recent book, Confessions of a Traffic Engineer, by Charles Marone.
Yeah, the strong towns.
And the notion of the Stroet as being sort of a compromise of the worst elements of both.
Yeah.
So yes, and I think also it also helps to, I think, because traffic engineering works really well on streets that are there for movement.
Yeah.
And that's also that's also a very important part of the book. So we work a lot with traffic engineering. We are not denouncing traffic engineering. It's a very useful set of skills to look and solve the issue of traffic, especially on those places. But what happened is that the logic, because of lack of counter logic, basically, it sort of monopolized and came to the front of our houses. And that's where I think we need to fight back. Also, and I think that's also, by the way, I think a beautiful Trojan horse for this is the self-driving car, because the self-driving car also could function relatively okay on that highway, freeway structure, because it's relatively predictable. There are no other conflicting goals, but we should use that to then say this should never spill out into the city, because this means that the entire logic that's connected to it will also be further solidified. So we need to fight back, and I think the exchange logic is a powerful way, and then we need to load it with all kinds of why is exchange so important. And there's so much research, and it also resonates as soon as you start talking with people. That, do you know your neighbors? And if you don't know your neighbors, do you think it's good, or would you like to know them better? How does public space cater for that? And again, there's 10 other discussions you can have, and people will get out of their houses for that, because there is a strong feeling that the current system, yes, it's comfortable for many, and those you will hear at meetings because they're losing something. But so many people are losing out. Like there's an amazing, also in the Netherlands, if you look at the statistics of people that do not have a car, that's in many cities, or most cities, or maybe all cities, the majority of people, they don't have a car. So why are we not uniting those people? Because people that have a car are united. They are represented by large bodies and by an industry. So how can we, so again, this comes back to, if we want to reclaim our streets or take back our streets and transform our lives, we have to start indeed maybe changing our names and become, but again, it's one thing I wanted to say about that, because I'm also a cycling professor and leading the Urban Cycling Institute, where we also have the discussion, like, is it not the wrong name? I still strongly believe that, and as in the 70s, that the bicycle still is a very strong, almost magical symbol that people understand. And it's not about the bicycle being a better version of the car, but the bicycle somehow represents, John Lennon was in bed with a bicycle in 1969. And not because he thought it would solve congestion, but the bicycle represented a different narrative, a different understanding of how our streets could function. So don't lose that either. That's
Well, I don't think I ever could. But I just also want to apologise. I'm for homo economists. I can never say the word anyway. So not all economists are terrible, but a lot are. So I'm also conscious of time now, and that Mel was keen to have some audience questions. Mel, did you want to do that now?
Probably got time for one more of yours, John, if you've got one more
Okay.
to pop in, and then I've got a couple in the chat for those of you listening at home. Think about some of your questions as well.
Cool.
Sure. Sorry, Pierre, over to you.
I'll on a slightly different topic. EVs are often offered up as a solution to all of the problems that cars cause in our cities, and as we're aware that they only resolve one of those problems, that being tailpipe emissions. Do you think that in the stuff that we're fighting for, do we lose an opportunity? When our car fleet is electrified? Like, we can stand up now and say, there is a climate benefit if we redistribute our street space and rejig our cities, that we're not spending all of this time traveling by car. Has that had any effect in Norway, where I think they've got 25% of their cars that now are on EVs? Has that affected the push to change the way we use our cities?
We don't need newer cars, we need fewer cars. That's, I think, and again, because the issues are much more complex. So that would be my short answer. So the longer answer is that, and again, I'm referring to a book here, so maybe somebody can put that one in the chat. It's a new book by Peter Norton. I already referred to his Fighting Traffic book, but his new book is called Autonorama, and he reveals quite convincingly how the car industry is manufacturing a story of, he calls that, keep the customer always dissatisfied. Yeah. So create the notion that the car-dependent city will in the future function well, and the solution for its current problems are brought to you by the sim industry that created the problems. And that's a story of, he shows that every 25 years a new narrative is introduced, a new technology, a new solution to the problem. And currently we are indeed, so the first waves were really about cities, the second waves was about smarter roadways and infrastructure, and the new wave is smarter vehicles, electrical vehicles, autonomous vehicles, all these things. And again, it is said to us that in 25 years from now, if everybody just buys those, we would have solved it. But there's no way around accepting that we do not have the resources to replace 2 billion cars worldwide. So it's a dead end, and it's so clear for me. That's what this is. This is the whole notion. It again links to the bigger notion of the idea that we can save our economic growth model without radical change by looking for green growth. This is also the idea we can still continue on the pathway for car-dependent cities, but now with greener cars, and then not solving all the other problems, or actually amplifying them. They will become worse because more people will now are now willing to buy a car. Indeed, they will lose some of the impetus or sense of urgency to change it because you have a green car. So what are you complaining about? So one of the things that I keep doing is also on social media is trying to show the complexity of the issues. So one example, so we have already covered a lot, so this will not lead to solving loneliness. If I'm being killed by a driver in an e-car or in a fossil fuel car, it doesn't really matter. Children will not be freer in this situation. But also one that came out yesterday, again, it's a confirmation of something we already know, but the biggest pollution of cars actually is microplastics, and they come from the tires, and we sort of ignored that element. But if it's so clear. John.
Oh, and brake pad dust too.
And small particles that lead to all kinds of terrible diseases, asthmatics, so the ultrafine particles. So again, so it should. So then people say, don't say that because it's good that we move from fossil fuels to e-fuels, And my role in confusing people actually then is playing in the hands of the fossil fuel industry. But I think that's a very problematic reasoning, because actually I think we are, by not discussing it, we are playing. So the richest man of the world is currently a car manufacturer. In whose hands are we playing now? And shouldn't we be, at least as an academic, I think my role is to I try to be what they call an honest broker by continuously showing that every choice we make has limits and we should be aware of them. So we always make choices. And I wished that we had that conversation better 100 years ago, because I think if we would have made more conscious choices, we wouldn't have created car-dependent cities in the first place.
That's the constant question of economists, of the opportunity cost of a particular decision. And, we've never examined that opportunity cost of car dependency.
Yeah.
No, and I think currently we are at the crossroads that are similar to the 70s, but in the Netherlands, the logic of growth in general and mobility growth related to that, we are hitting a dead end. So this is we have to reconsider that. There is no way around, and somehow that again leads to the first question, which I also thought was so powerful, because that explains again why it is so painful for people to accept this. Because we cannot continue this. We cannot be comfortable as frogs in the slowly boiling water. It's no longer, and it's painful. You have to realize that we have to have radical change. It's painful to look the beast in the mouth and to see that in the Netherlands every day 2 people die in the system. It's much easier to just ignore that, or to say, yeah, it's part of statistics. Statistics go up and down, and maybe we do some road safety campaigning, and we do our best to save lives. It's no longer acceptable, and that's painful. So it's akin to the Stockholm syndrome, where you just ignore the fact that basically car dependency cannot work. Ignore it as long as possible, and even defend it fiercely.
Absolutely. I think I have to hand over to Mel now.
Thank you very much, John.
Some audio questions.
And while we have John and Pierre, I just want to big thank you to both of you for volunteering your time to come in tonight to be part of this conversation. Bike West are the organisation. I've put the link in the chat, so if you're interested in finding out more about what John and Pierre and Bike West do here in Melbourne, jump on and have a look at their group. But we are going to go over to some audience questions. There's a few that's already been in the chat. So Diane, if you're still on and you wanted to come on and ask your question, I'll give you a second. Otherwise, I might just ask it for you. Okay, Diane may have logged off. I'll ask the question. So she was asking, how do we improve the bike infrastructure here in Australia and improve the mindset respect of motorised vehicle drivers? There are 2 key differences between Australia and the Netherlands.
Wow, yeah, every question is a rabbit hole. But also relating back to the conversation we had, I think, be aware that the bike infrastructure, as often thought about, and the Dutch example, be aware that it's quite likely that it's a dead end, and because it's partly following the same traffic engineering logic of dividing space for different users. So what do you do with new modes? How can you keep cutting up the public space? That's one, and 2, it led to higher safety, but it's not safe in the Netherlands because we created not separated bike infrastructure. We actually created separated car infrastructure, and at all kinds of points you still have conflicts or interactions that are deadly, and it's not a heaven here. And I do not believe. I'm quite aggressively skeptical of the second part, of the idea that we can somehow change humans. And again, I refer you to the I think it was Autonorama again for Peter Norton. He sort of opened it. He said because we tend to think about crashes or accidents. I saw already, crashes as being for 90% caused by human behavior. That's what we hear all the time. So if we can just change the mindset or the respect or the behavior of motorists, it would be fine. But it's not a human error. It's what Peter Norton calls a species error. Humans are incapable of using such a machine in a way that is safe. It's just impossible. As a human, you are not capable of being every second focused. And even if you, so I tell this to people in the Netherlands, where we are so happy that also partly because of our book, all the cities are going from 50 to 30 kilometers per hour as a speed limit, but 30 kilometers per hour is 8 meters per second. That's 2 parked cars every second, 30 kilometers per hour. That's not safe at all. If your attention lapses for 1 second in that situation, you pass 2 parked cars. That's two potential children that were in front of you, and you didn't even start braking, because if you're 1 second, so I would say that we should stop focusing again on trying to fit human behavior into the machine, and accept that the machine itself does not take normal human behavior into account. It's not that drivers are drunk, that's the problem. It's not that drivers are distracted by phones, that's the problem. We are distracted by default, and we should not have systems that assume that we're not. So we should, I think, well, partly this is why I rally around the notion of intelligent speed assistance, the notion that cars should be limited. Because any machine that kills, what is it, almost 3,000 people a day globally? Let's assume that you have a coffee machine with those numbers. That coffee machine would not be acceptable. Yeah, it's 28,000. It's around 3,000 people die every day. Every day.
Yeah. And on top of that, about 5 times that amount are seriously and permanently injured, and will
exactly.
never go to work or study again.
And important here is that it's not people dying; it's people killing each other. So also the other person that did it is also a victim of that same system. So the violence is built into the system. And so this question for me is always let's be aware of that. And I think it's distracting to keep talking about how can we have another campaign, how can we change the mindset, how can everybody behave a bit better. The system itself is systematically violent. I wrote an article about that. I can maybe link to that as well. It's about how in our media and in our social debate, this framing is sort of also manufactured. It's continuously, every newspaper article about traffic crashes sort of uses implicitly, not explicit, but implicitly a language that sort of avoids pointing to the systemic violent nature of that. So that's, I think, part of the problem. That's why we don't have a sense of urgency of changing. So it's in the chat. It's an open access academic article. So we also there, I think there's a powerful change option if we change our narrative. We should talk about the violence of the system, and the fact that a car industry doesn't want us to talk about that should already be a big warning flag.
These are all big questions out there. I feel like the deeper we dive, the more complex the issues and the questions become.
Well, I'm in my genes. I'm a punker. So in the end, it's very simple. It's all capitalism. So we should talk about. We should have another meeting to discuss capitalism. But it's all these dynamics are well. I think the thing that we can do is to question the things that we take for granted. That's what the book is about. And that we can do on every level, on our daily lives, on the jobs that we do. What are the things that you take for granted? And so one example, and I know we are running out of time, but one powerful example that I did in my university is we always talked, so we talked about rethinking the university and about all the dynamics in academic life that are very problematic and perverse. And everybody agrees on that, but we are not changing. And one of the things that I noticed in the strikes that we had is that we talk about management as something up there. So literally we use all kinds of metaphors where management is up there. But management is there to support the working floor, the working conditions. So what happens if we turn around the model? If we say managers are the ones that support, and the people that do the work are actually up there. That a simple change of visual language, but also language, is always pointing down and say management are those that are supporting working conditions. We are not the ones supporting managers. That was not the idea. And again, it showed that how powerful it is to become lenient with language, and not to become nihilist. But the language we use is not a mirror of reality. It profoundly shapes what we see, and therefore it profoundly shapes the reality we create. So we need to become more aware, more reflexive on how that language limits us and how it can free us as well.
Well, what a conversation we've been lucky to have tonight. We are unfortunately coming to the end. I know that there are some more questions out there and some more hands up, but we have unfortunately run out of time. So I would like to say a few thank yous. I think this is a conversation that we're all going to be thinking about for days to come. And so I do recommend get out, get involved in your local community, and see if you can be a part of the change that we've been talking about here tonight. I would like to thank Hobsons Bay City Council Transport and Engineering Department tonight. They've been supporting us financially to help run this event. A big thank you to Cora and all at Scribe Publications for getting me in contact with Marco and making tonight possible. Thanks to John and Pierre at BikeWest, such great conversation partners. So thank you very much. A very big thank you to Marco for joining us from the other side of the world for tonight's event. It has been an absolute treat. To all of you at home, thank you for logging in. We thank you for being a part of it, and sorry we've run out of time for so many questions, but we look forward to seeing you at our next Enviro Centre event. I am going to turn off the recording now, but I would like to say thank you, and we'll see you all next time.
Yeah. Thanks so much.